Welcome back, everyone. We will start with Lecture 8, the second lecture for today, which is day 3. And I was just finishing at the end of the last hour. I was going a bit slowly through my notes. So I will very briefly mention some of the writers and points that I did not have time for in the Lecture 7, which is I'll just mention very briefly Wole Soyinka's uh, theses or argument, Ngugi's Decolonizing the Mind, Chinua Achebe. I think I will go past because he's much more well known, but mention also Adichie's briefly her essay, because we do have to get on to the main parts of um, Lecture 8, which is simply called Caribbean Literature, very broadly. And this was where we will look directly at some of their writings. Um, I was just wanted to highlight a couple of points that I think are important. As Michael Dash puts it in his introduction to Glissant's Caribbean Discourse, I think he makes a good observation by saying that Glissant, and this could speak for many of the writers, Glissant departs from the earlier Caribbean fixation with this idea of prelapsarian innocence, an origin before the fall of the New World. Remember, yesterday I was talking about that idea, which is very biblical, about the fall. And we saw in Vespucci that's still the vestiges of that idea of the sort of noble savage living in a paradise, right? So he moves on from that, and he's not the only one, but he moves on from that, and he instead emphasizes formlessness, latency, mutation. So creolization, hybridity, whatever you want to call it, mutation, both botanically and in culturally. Um, and so that's one thing. The other thing is related to that is the use of Creole. It is, remember that these writers, it is their mother tongue, these Caribbean writers. Um, and the language of intimacy and friendship, but French was seen as the language of empowerment. So Michael Dash says it's natural that they turn to French. And so if you, for example, looked at, and these are in my notes that I will later post, Glissant's comments, for example, in his essays on flowers. He says the flowers that grow today are cultivated for export. Sculptured, spotless, striking in precision and quality, but they are heavy also, full, lasting. You can keep them for 2 weeks in a vase. And then he goes on and names them, right? The heliconia and so forth, the king of kings or the red ginger lily, but they have no fragrance. So now that is metaphorical as well as literal. So this commodification of botany. For example, when I visited a friend in Colombia, South America, and even though that's a very different context, tulips and roses, especially roses, are a huge export there. And I saw these vast areas, orchards, rose gardens. He also has an interest, if you're interested, he in his journal, which I asked you to read, he writes down different signs, actual signs he saw when he visited. He had gone abroad to France, and then he comes back, and this is in the 1970s. So he says, for example, an advertisement for a brand of paint. What is good for Europe is good for the French Caribbean. That's for paint, right? Or another one, it is forbidden to speak Creole in class or on the playground. So this idea of being forbidden is common still in many parts of the world, um, and so on. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was Wole Soyinka. If you're interested, I'm not an expert on Soyinka, but he's got it's rather dense work called Myth, Literature, and the African World from the 1980s, I believe. It's his main work of criticism. But I thought I'd just mention two statements. One is that the significance of Ogun, a god. So he mixes myth with a kind of modern critique. That's that's what I wanted to convey. So he mentions Ogun is a personal and psychological as well as communal and religious deity. Um, and if you read works by him like Death and the King's Horseman, for example, it's brilliant plays that um, get to the complexities and tensions of the conflict that arises when the European colonizers come and the, in his case, the Yoruba Nigerians confront them, similar to what Achebe does. And then he also, we might say that um, he says this interesting thing. Bruce King, sorry, comments, the scholar, that a decentering of an alien vision involves a necessary part of authentic modernization. Interesting statement. So, if you back to the same problem of being modern, but not in the way that the European is modern. So I'll leave it at that. Finally, the last thing I want to mention is Ngugi's Decolonizing the Mind. There's also Barrel of a Pen, 1983, Decolonizing the Mind, 1986. They're not long, easy to read. Remember, he's a novelist, not a poet, but he has written these important essays. And I'm just singling out basically one of them. Language as culture is the collective memory bank of a people's experience in history. Interesting statement, right? And then Lumba, I would just add in closing, Ania Lumba says that Ngugi casts a division between writers who were part of those who wrote in indigenous languages we talked about, right? He advocated writing in Gikuyu. Achebe disappeared. She concludes that anti-colonial writings or post-colonial writings, whatever we call them, need both perspectives. So there's no way to come down on one. So don't worry if you can't be, you don't have to argue that one is the right way and the other is not. I think it depends on the situation, the context. I promised to mention Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's essays. The one I'm mostly familiar with is We Should All Be Feminists. You're probably familiar with that. It was also a TED Talk. Sometimes she takes talks and then edits them and publishes them. She's just come out with a new novel, I realized, I just saw. So that would be interesting to, first in 10 years. And let me just say this. She says at one of her statements is, gender matters. Men and women experience the world differently. That's interesting, right? Gender colors the way we experience the world, but we can change that. So, not much to give you there, but you can read more of this in the notes. And I thought I just wanted to share that people listen to best-selling writers, right? And she is a great writer. And if you have a platform, it's important to use it in a productive way. Lecture 8, as I said, is Caribbean literature. So here I'm going to read some poems by Glissant, which, as I said, can be a bit, even in French, they're a bit elusive as well as allusive. They allude to things that I'm not quite sure about sometimes, and they're slippery. So, for example, he says in a poem, he writes them in French. So I have the original French for one of them, which I won't read, but it's called Vertige des temps froids, cold weather vertigo. Here's a guy from a tropical island, right? So he'll play on that. So climate, right? And that's why I thought this poem was interesting. He says, ashes, thickets, oh, your days are abandoned into infinity. Your lies, like finery, are tears enlivening a mirror. Shallow mirror and high tower, water of death imprisoned in no ocean except the plowing of furrowed fever and clay. Weep that my space may bind space upon you more completely than any ocean can bind an exile. My fevers furrow thickets dead to such lies, ashes still, and more than infinite clay. I will leave you to interpret that. I've thought about that a lot and how to interpret it. What I want to call attention to mainly are the words he uses. I think also I would have to be, I think it would leave it to the people who know French as perfectly, right, to interpret this. But notice he mentions space, and his theory, his ideas on spatiality are really important. He also mentions exile, the word ocean, clay. So he comes back again and again to, that's another way to read some writers, is to say, what words are they using? Has anyone done a cloud map? A word map, sorry. A word cloud. Finally, my brain got there. A word cloud is to then you can feed it into these apps, and it's interesting because sometimes some will do emphasize. It'll show, some will give you all the words, but some will emphasize in bold, in big letters, the word that is repeated. And I think that's interesting to see what's repeated there. That's just one way to do that. He has another one called cities. And again, I'm looking at the words. This is very short. On the wool of noise, some object of silence, but so immense. The issue is love, it's turning towards solicitous shop windows. Who stops? Who gazes? Here thought arranges the display of rags, and charm lingers on and on. There, giant cats scratch the earth, the steel of silence and faith with no object. A couple of points as I see it. Giant cats scratching the earth, the steel of silence, a kind of sterile environment that's alienating. And if so, I think cities he sees as rather alienating. But the other way to read this is, I like to do these correspondences, is to look at other poets' readings of cities and compare and contrast that. For example, if you look at in the 1860s, Charles Baudelaire, Les Fleurs du Mal, right? The flowers of evil, and he talks about cities, unreal city. So that link is there. I think a lot of writers are consciously intertextual. If you're interested, this is a footnote. Baudelaire also sometimes has Edgar Allan Poe in mind. That's another story, because he translated Poe. More importantly, I think Glissant sees himself, as does Aimé Césaire, as part of a lineage of French literature, right? So they're not casting all that literature away. They're saying we're adding something new, and therefore we can change that canon. So I think they're self-consciously adding, just as Derek Walcott adds to the English canon, right? We come now to Merle Hodge and her interesting novel that I've taught a couple of times, Crick Crack Monkey, which comes from a children's game. If you read this novel, it's really fascinating to see its wordplay from a child's eye point of view and compare it to what Arundhati Roy does in The God of Small Things, because it's the very similar kind of way in which children psychologically respond to language, right? And I think very well done. So that's a fascinating way to look at it. However, what's interesting is that now we come to Trinidad and Tobago, which is, as we know, English speaking mostly. And though they're right across from Venezuela, so there's a lot of interaction with Spanish, but most of the speakers are English. We also have pop stars like, who's the singer? She was born in Trinidad and Tobago. Now my brain is a blank. So pop singer, she's a rapper in America. Anyway, I'll think of her. Who? No, we could stay an hour and try to figure this out. No, I will. I'll think of her. it's right on the. Oh, I hate that. So she is proud of her Indian heritage, but doesn't talk about it a lot. So when you'll know her name when I mention it. So of course, we have others from the Caribbean, who are singers and have been for some time, whether it's from Jamaica or so forth. So the arts have been important and have been an important export, the popular arts, I should say. So that's there. But here we come to Merle Hodge from Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica Kincaid, Antigua, Derek Walcott, I've mentioned, from St. Lucia, Edwidge Danticat from Haiti, writing in English, even though in Haiti they speak a kind of a Creole French. And there are Haitian writers who write in that. Just as in Mauritius, you can have people writing in French and English. That's fascinating, right? So I think a couple of, one point to keep in mind is and I'm dropping a couple of well-known terms from post-colonial once now and again, is the word hegemony, which is a good Greek word. The root of it is Greek, and the famous Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci talks about it, who gave us the word subaltern, which he took from the British Army. So hegemony is the power of the ruling class to convince other classes that their interests are in the interest of all. That's classic colonialism, right? That's another way to read it. Often not only through economic and political control, but mainly through English education and media. And that's what Glissant is picking up and these writers are perceiving, as Indians did in the 19th century, right? Because already we forget that mass media started in the 19th century. So I wanted to mention that. So Crick Crack Monkey. I mentioned, the other thing is I said, I think at some point, yes, the broad term for today's lecture is African and Caribbean post-colonial environmental literatures. Caliban writes back, and I've mentioned the name Caliban as the figure from The Tempest. And I want to just remind us of that. Tempest can be read as an allegory of conquest, right? In fact, that was one of the first canonical works that was about 35 years ago read by post-colonial scholars. If you're talking about canonical, reread, reinterpreted. And if you see, it works brilliantly for the Caribbean. So I mentioned shipwreck. The figure is Caliban, who learns the language better than the master and talks back. And I think they see it as a reflection of their own circumstance. So if we look at Crick Crack Monkey more specifically, the specific challenge that the narrator is T-E-E. Has anyone read this? How many read this? No, it's not taught a lot, but it's a short novel written in 1970 in English by a writer who's still alive. She was a professor as well at the University of West Indies. The narrator, it's set in the early 1950s when Trinidad and Tobago was still colonized. It's similar to Nigeria, which became independent in 1960. It's around then that Trinidad becomes independent. So race is a big part of this, as is the mimicry. So we haven't talked about colonial mimicry, which is a mainstay in post-colonial studies, and I think you all know about Homi Bhabha's idea, where you mimic a colonizer who sometimes wants to have a certain number of people mimic them, but then sometimes the mimicry can turn to mockery. One thing to keep in mind in colonialism is that, and George Orwell writes this eloquently in some of his essays, like Shooting an Elephant, is that you never know when that mockery might happen, or you never know when there might be a rebellion. So they're always like, so they make compounds, they put walls up, right? Now, sadly, we still live in walled environments a lot, but for other reasons. Right? Um, T is the struggles she faces are not identical to those faced by. Every situation is different, right? So I want to emphasize that. I don't want to say that everything is the same. Nonetheless, they do have the broad experience of being made to feel culturally inferior, as Césaire and Fanon have noted. And the colonial motherland, it's always like, who's going abroad, right? Who's lucky enough to go to New York? And by this time, America, post-World War II, rather than England, had become kind of the place to go for the Caribbean islanders. Trinidad and Tobago, originally, by the way, I should give a backdrop. I don't do that enough. Had indigenous Arawak and Carib peoples, as I mentioned. And the reason it's called Trinidad is because Columbus called one of those two main islands La Isla de la Trinidad, or Island of the Holy Trinity. So that's why. Tobago is a more, I think there's some debate on where that comes from, but it's probably a local Carib or Arawak word. In 1838, African origin slaves were freed with the abolition of slavery in Britain by Britain, and they continue to live on the islands. But of course, as we know, because slavery ended, they still wanted cheap labor, so they brought Indians and sometimes some Chinese to the islands, which that's why we have V.S. Naipaul also has a writer. Finally, in 1962, I was 2 years wrong, the Twin Islands gained independence. And by the way, his first prime minister was Eric Williams, who was a scholar and who was one of the first to talk about how slavery in the plantation, I want to keep that in mind, enabled these Western powers to gain a lot of wealth. So economics, he was an economic historian. So I just wanted to mention that. We have three images that are, and I don't know if, Ankita, you have those three images, the other three, thanks. The colored ones, yeah, it's just a simple illustration. But so here's a picture from not too long ago from the web. I mean, I got it from images, but roti shop. This is in Trinidad and Tobago. But look at the fusion of this, right? So beans, doubles, and so they have their own kind of lingo sometimes. I don't know what roti skin is, but it's taking the Indian foods and creolizing them. And so if you, I don't know if anyone knows, like we have the International Night sometimes in my university, and it's interesting to see how East Africans, as well as Caribbean islanders, all have some dish with curry. It's not as good, but it's interesting. So that's one, and then the other one. This is just to illustrate creolization. Yeah, any one of those. So here you have a Hindu festival on Trinidad and Tobago, actually it's a mix. These are sometimes you can join into a lot of these. You don't have to be of that religion, but they have Hindu festivals. They have some Muslim ones. They have Catholic ones. So this is just another example of creolization. And then the last image, which I think you're all familiar with, is Carnival, which has especially been infused in Brazil and in the Caribbean by African heritage people, but it is originally a Catholic tradition, this idea of the end of Lent, the end of fasting. So I don't think it's much religious anymore. But what this tells you is that you can see the sort of this idea of mixing of cultures, the vibrancy, and it's a lot of fun with these kinds of cultures. Some of the current generation in Mauritius and in Trinidad, who are descendants, say, of Indians, no longer speak the language, like Hindi or whatever it was. But it wasn't that long ago. I have a friend in Mauritius in her 70s, a retired professor. She knows Hindi and she comes to India a lot, but her children don't. So you see this kind of, it's still evolving. So thank you. That's all I wanted to show. Um, let's see. So I want to keep an eye on, when I read a little snippets here, an eye on, actually, I don't know if I have many snippets from the novel, but this, if you read the novel, one of the tensions is T is raised by her auntie because her parents are no longer around, and who speaks in the very dialect, we might call it. It's very understandable, and Hodge does a beautiful way of rendering it because I think that's her background. But at some point, there's a legal battle between another aunt who is called Aunt Beatrice, who is very anglicized, who wants to keep T and form her into her own image. She doesn't really, it's not like she cares for T that much. She wants her to be just like that, the mimicry aspect. And there's a lot of humor here, but there's a lot of poignancy. So T grows up confused, right? The access to power, as you know, especially in the 1950s, still a colonial period, is through English. But then there's a lot of images of English education. So that's another key theme in a lot of these novels, whether it's Nervous Conditions or Merle High or this one. And also, if you look at it in a certain way, Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things, many, many novels which deal with education. It makes sense, right? So how language gets distorted, or how your own language, mother tongue, is treated as lesser, is denigrated. We know this story, and we know that things are changing for good. But as I said, even how many works are you going to find that are written in Creole or Pidgin? Not many. When Ken Saro-Wiwa wrote Soza Boy in Pidgin, that was the only work he wrote that way, right? Some consider it his best novel, but it's hard to write to change that. Hodge focuses on characters inspired by her own African Trinidadian community, but there are some Indian named characters who are friends of them. So it's also a culture that mixes, but also some members of the same community may look down on other members, right? It's sort of this. So in the U.S., there's a term called colorism, right? So it's a sensitive topic even among African Americans, but the fairer you are, the better the more privileges you're seen to have, and so on, even within the same family. And there are a lot of books, novels, and TV shows about this. So sadly, that's still with us. That happens here. T is a little fairer, and so she's seen, but she's also smart. That's the key thing. It's semi-autobiographical. So I think Merle Hodge, she went on to become a professor, right? So she has to learn this formal English. The other aspect I want to keep in mind is, and I've said this before, but when you have these a child's eye point of view tends to be very popular for post-colonial writing, especially by women writers, I would say. So what we have is a kind of fictional conceit whereby the formal presentation, the formal narration, is understood to be the adult version of that child, if it's told in the first person, recollecting it, right? So there's a gap here where we then we infer that this child has then become educated. And here comes the question that the paradox we talked about yesterday. which is also the question that Spivak asked about the subaltern. If you then become enculturated in the language of the dominant class, can you really recollect your, sort of childhood innocence accurately? That is to say, or can you render a novel if you're an author, or accurately, or will it all become a reflection of the biases of that dominant culture? You can only do your best, but it's really surprising how many novels there are like this, right? There's Ice Candy Man, also called Cracking India. There's, yeah, Nervous Conditions, and so on and so forth. And so that conceit is a gap that we know has happened, but is not talked about directly. The other, I've mentioned race and colorism. The other, education, of course. And the question is, what kind of education? Right? So I think Hodge does a good job of showing that the different schools are there, where they have the very traditional British, strict education, and wanting to turn you into a little English person. So here's a couple quotes. Often T slips into formal English when, as the narrator, she describes her reaction to one of the teachers asking if she wants to go out and play. And she replies, she's unsure about how to read that. We're also treated to kids' views of British literature. So another thing that comes into play is the textbooks. They're all written, that's the other aspect of education. They're all written with young English kids in mind. And so these people like T, who are pretty sharp, they're confused, right? And she also invents an imaginary friend. Just a short chapter, it's 2 pages, where it's delightful, where it's a very, British young, and she gives her a name, and she has T, and then suddenly she's grown out of that. So it's again, these subtle pressures of how to behave. I'm sorry, I thought I had some snippets from the novel here, but I don't, but I encourage you to read it. It's a lot of fun. I'll go on to Jamaica Kincaid, A Small Place. This is also a slender book. It's an essay, and it is about Jamaica Kincaid, the author, returns to Antigua, the island nation where she grew up. It didn't become independent or semi-independent until 1980. She wrote this in 1988. Already she finds that tourism is its main economy, so all the tourists are from outside the island, right? From all over the world. And the local Antiguans are still, by and large, pretty poor. There's a scholar at University of Virginia named Jahan Ramazani. He's an Iranian-American who writes wonderfully about post-colonial poetry, specifically. And and in this case, he's commenting on Kincaid. So he normally writes mostly about poetry. But he says, this is probably the best known indictment of tourism. And what she does is she addresses the reader. So let me read an example from this. It implicates the reader in the problems because it says, you, the tourist. And some of my students will say, "What? I'm not tourist." But it's the idea of the privileged person, right? You're not a poor Antiguan. And it becomes kind of funny in some ways. But it's serious. You are not an ugly person all the time. You are not an ugly person ordinarily. You are not an ugly person day to day. From day to day, you are a nice person. From day to day, all the people who are supposed to love you on the whole do. From day to day, as you walk down a busy street in the large and modern and prosperous city in which you work and lie, dismayed and puzzled at how alone you can feel in this crowd, how awful it is to go unnoticed, how awful it is to go unloved, even as you are surrounded by more people than you could possibly get to know in a lifetime that lasted for millennia. And then out of the corner of your eye, you see someone looking at you with an absolute pleasure is written all over that person's face. And then you realize that you are not as revolting a presence as you think you are. And so ordinarily, you are a nice person, an attractive person, a person capable of drawing to yourself the attraction of other people, and so on. Then she goes, next paragraph. That the native does not like the tourist is not hard to explain, for every native of every place is a potential tourist, and every tourist is a native of somewhere. Every native everywhere lives a life of overwhelming and crushing banality, and boredom, and desperation, and depression. And every deed, good and bad, is an attempt to forget this. Every native would like to find a way out. Every native would like a rest. Every native would like a tour. But most natives in the world cannot go anywhere. They are too poor. They are too poor to go anywhere. They are too poor to escape the reality of their lives, and they are too poor to live properly in the place they live, which is the very place you, the tourist, want to go. So she's being sarcastic, like, you are ordinarily a nice person. And then, if you read the book, she goes on and addressing you. So when the natives see you, the tourists, they envy you. They envy your ability to leave your own banality and boredom. They envy your ability to turn their own banality and boredom into a source of pleasure for yourself. Hard-hitting. And it goes on that way. And it's really, I think, brilliantly done. And even though she knows she's returning as a tourist, ironically, right? She's not doing all the resorts, and she's there to write, but she's now one of the privileged that left the island. So again, this idea of island, and it's a small place, an insignificant place, right? So the irony, perhaps, is that writers can draw attention to those insignificant places, right? And put them on the map, so to speak, rather than being on the map simply for a typhoon or disaster, right? Or some other calamity. You're on the map because you're really, it's a hard-hitting critique of how the West commodifies what Graham Huggan calls the post-colonial exotic, the selling and commodification of these kinds of spaces. And the Caribbean is a prime example where flocks of North Americans go there all the time, right? Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, so forth, Bahamas. And they vary in of course, they're all different, but it's there to be a playground. It's there not as a presence, but there as an object, right? If you will. So in their useful introduction, though it's a bit dated now, in 2010, it's 15 years ago, Graham Huggan and Helen Tiffin in Post-Colonial Eco-Criticisms, it's a good overview of post-colonial eco-criticism. They summarize this as we have come to see that environmental issues are not only central to the projects of European conquest, so it's not only about colonization and all, but are inherent in the ideologies of imperialism and racism on which those projects historically depend. So embedded within Western knowledge paradigms, perhaps, so the argument goes, are these ways that condition our perception of the world, right? The history, what matters, what doesn't. I was reading, interestingly enough, this is not just in the post-colonial, classical colonial world. I was reading an essay by Milan Kundera, the great Czech writer, who talks about how the Eastern Europe was similar when he migrated to France, and how Eastern Europe was similarly looked down upon, right? And not as a small, insignificant place, right? And so you don't have to, I think many people can identify with this on some level or another. So I don't mean to say that this is unique to the Caribbean or to a post-colonial situation. For example, in the places that had outright slavery and racism, it's particularly harsh. So, for example, in these areas, which are the Martinican writers, Jamaica Kincaid, and I'm going to get to Derek Walcott in a minute. We have, for example, we know, for example, the historical treatment of animals was transferred to slaves and then to colonized laborers. So animal imagery was powerful. Peoples were also during the colonial era paraded before royalty and the public in Europe and exoticized in a way that non-human animals were. Also at work was the concept of, as we said, the noble savage. So although Kincaid does not mention all of these explicitly, it's clear that's what's behind her thinking. So as you may be, again, coming back to why we are studying this in the first place, or why we have these concepts, I think it gives us tools with which to better appreciate and unpack works like A Small Place. That if I've had my students read it, and it's easy to read, but it's uncomfortable. But then if you give them this context, right? Because they don't know anything about, actually a couple of them have been on cruises to the Caribbean with their grandparents. Oh yes, it was very nice, and there's no understanding of who's going to talk about, after all, let's admit it, if you go on the cruises that go on these cruise ships and you get off at the port, it's very popular apparently in North America, but obviously those places don't want to advertise that because their economy depends on pleasing the tourist and selling them. And that's another thing that Kincaid talks about. And she says that, the places where you do see the poverty, that's they'll never take you there unless you make an effort. So, I think I'll stop there with Jamaica Kincaid. And I don't remember what time I started, but time is relative, as we said. So, speaking of time and space, this might be a good point to mention that one interest of mine has been how the acceleration of time and space, the acceleration of time with, by that I mean starting in the 1830s with the advent of the railroad. That's another part of the modern period that I was talking about. Until 1830-ish, humans had never gone faster than the horse, right? So suddenly you get, right, and then distance, space shrinks as well because of the telegraph and then telephone. Now, of course, it's instantaneous. So what does that do to our way of thinking? The arts reflect that, right? In the early 1900s, you get the abstract, like the Impressionists. You get the Cubists. They're all responding to this idea. So I wanted to mention that, and this is particularly acutely felt in the colonial context because already that land is being taken over explicitly, right? And so you're adding to this. And anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. Does anyone know how much time we have? Okay, thank you. So, okay, we have some time. Derek Walcott, Omeros. I'm just going to read the first excerpts. It's from chapter 1, section 1, but you'll have to look at the book yourself. This is how one sunrise we cut down them canoes. Philoctete, which is the sort of main character, notice the Greek name, smiles for the tourists who try taking his soul with their cameras. Once windbreak, bring the news to the Laurier Canal. Now he's written this. This is English. This is Derek Walcott from St. Lucia, not French. So he's getting the lingo of the place where he grew up. Once wind bring the news to the Laurier Canal, their leaves start shaking the minute the axe of sunlight hit the cedars. They could see the axes in their own eyes. Wind lift the ferns. They sound like the sea that feed us. Fishermen all our life. And the ferns nodded, yes, the trees have to die. So fists jam into our jacket. 'Cause the heights was cold and our breath making feathers like the mist we passed the rum. When it came back, it gave us the spirit to turn into murderers. I lift up the axe and pray for strength in my hands to wound the first cedar. Interesting image of wounding a tree. Dew was filling my eyes, but I fire one more white run. Then we advance. That's his Philoctete narrating, and then we have the omniscient narrator. For some extra silver under sea almond, he shows them a scar made by a rusted anchor, rolling one trouser leg up with the rising moan of a conch. Rusted anchor, conch, images of the sea of shipping. It has puckered like the corolla of a sea urchin. He does not explain its cure. It have some things, he smiles, worth more than $1. He has left it to a garrulous waterfall to pour out his secret down La Sorcière, since the tall laurels fell, for the ground dove's mating call to pass on its note to the blue, tacit mountains, whose talkative brooks, carrying it to the sea, turn into idle pools where the clear minnows shoot, and an egret stalks the reeds with one rusted cry as it stabs and stabs the mud with one lifting foot. Then silence is sawn in half by a dragonfly, as eels sign their names along the clear bottom sand, when the sunrise brightens the river's memory and waves of huge ferns are nodding to the sea's sound. Although smoke forgets the earth from which it ascends, interesting, and nettles guard the holes where the laurels were killed. An iguana hears the axes, clouding each lens over its lost name, when the hunched island was called Iwanalao, which means where the, he doesn't say which means, but where the iguana is found. That's, I guess, what the island was called. But taking its own time, the iguana will scale the rigging of vines in a year, its dewlap fanned, its elbows akimbo, its deliberate tail moving with the island, the split pods of its eyes ripened in a pause that lasted for centuries, that rose with the arawaks, smoke till a new race unknown to the lizards stood measuring the trees. And he talks about some modern things like the generator coming in and so forth. Just in what you've heard, it's a bit of an unfair question because you've heard this. I was reading it pretty quickly, but you heard the images, objects of the sea, but also what image. If this were a class with discussion, I would say what what atmosphere does this create? And in a way, you can see that it is rather a beautiful image of nature, almost as if it's untouched by humans, right? The iguana, but then the iguana hears the axes, right? The axes are cutting down the trees. So you have environmental degradation. He's not romanticizing this past, but I think he likes the idea of entanglement. Remember that? Timothy Morton calls it a mesh, whatever you want to call it. It's how humans are entangled with nature, but in this case, of course, destroying it at the same time. So I'll leave it at that. Some commentary by Jahan Ramazami on this poetry that might be useful. In Omeros, Walcott places in his St. Lucian Inferno the traders who in elected office saw the land as views for hotels, right? So Walcott is similarly criticizing the tourism industry as is Jamaica Kincaid for Antigua. And permitting horrendous exploitation of the island's natural beauty. His character Hector dies in a crash after forsaking his fishing canoe for a tourist van, so he tries to move into the tourist industry. And Helen, these are different characters, quits a demeaning job waiting tables at a resort hotel, though she eventually accommodates herself to a different hotel job that allows her to retain her human and cultural dignity. Yet, despite his denunciations, Walcott has acknowledged that his extended North American stays and class status have made him somewhat of a tourist in his own country, just like Jamaica Kincaid. There's the paradox. If you get a better perspective of your island by leaving it, as Joyce did, you also have a certain privilege, right? And that is hard. And that there, one thing that's useful, healthy about a lot of post-colonial writers is they are self-critical, right? This is different from, say, the classic colonial European writings, which presume to be the imperious eye, right? The eye that commands everything it sees, as Mary Louise Pratt says something like that. So here they are very acutely self-conscious, and so I think that's worth keeping in mind. And then he says, when I come down here, he said, perhaps literally, I'm a tourist myself coming from America. He glances at himself in Omeros in the opening portrait of Philoctete, who smiles for the tourists who try taking his soul with their cameras, even as the fisherman ruefully reflects on his wounds' poetry like foldedness and recalcitrance. It have some things, he smiles, worth more than $1, but of course the poet will tell the story of this wound and reap profits from the sale. Elsewhere in the poem, he criticizes himself for wanting, quote, the poor to stay in the same light so that I could transfix them in amber, for the hypocrisy of loving them from hotels. Ambivalence. The classic ambivalence of a diasporic person, perhaps. And I'll leave it, close the Walcott section with that. There's much more to say about Walcott, of course, but I'll stop there. The last author we have is, just in the last 4 minutes, is The Farming of Bones by Edwidge Danticat. And this is the context, all I have time for is to paint the context of the Dominican Republic, which is an island that is shared with Haiti, and there's a straight line down the middle. My colleague, who'd just been there a couple of years in our department, her name is Gibet Encarnacion, is Dominican American. So she's focusing on this, as part of her research. And one of the things she gave a talk on was how this book is about, the reason it's called The Farming of Bones is it's set in 1937, around the time of a massacre that was incited at the behest of a dictator named General Trujillo, whom the West propped up, North America propped up. And until then, the Dominicans, here you have the classic arbitrary border, straight line, right? Who cares about geography? Right? And Haitians speak French, Dominicans speak Spanish. But before 1937, they would often go across borders for labor, right? And sometimes intermarry, so they'd have different Creole languages. But in 1937, Trujillo began his dictatorship in 1930 for 30 years. And he became, as a general, I don't know if that was the reason, but I think he was just dictatorial. He was just a dictator. And he became more and more hardline. And eventually, there's a lot more behind this idea of the tensions. The U.S. Army was called in 1911 and so on. And so he ordered his soldiers to then kill and displace the Haitians, who had come and worked for decades. And they slaughtered 10 to 15,000 men, women, and children. This has become a big scar in the country. And so what she talks about in the novel is she tries to give us a sense of the complexities of this situation. Let me just read in the last 2 minutes from another scholar that I've borrowed from. Indeed, The Farming of Bones abounds with complex shades of meaning. In the first chapters of the novel, Amabel is the main character, helped Senora Valencia give birth to twins. When the doctor finally arrives to check on the newborn's health, he says to Amabel, many of us start out as twins in the belly and do away with the other. Haitians and Dominicans, right? Once again, by the way, twins that comes up more than once in post-colonial literature, but that's another story. Once again, Danticat has deftly teased out the duality of language. These countries are vying for resources on the same island, are much like twins. The most horrifying example of language play in the novel is the treatment of the word perejil, P-E-R-E-J-I-L, or parsley. In order to prove to soldiers that they are Dominican, a person must be able to trill the R, perejil, right? But if you can't do that, you're killed. Crazy. We know these sad things from history, don't we? And so, if you're interested, Danticat has written several novels about Haiti, which some are set in the present. There's one that's sort of semi-autobiographical where she goes back as an American Haitian. She also talks in one about her brother. It's more, I think that's an essay in which her older brother, has some problems. And if you think about what's happening in Haiti today, it's really tragic, right? But it's not just about Haiti. It's about the Dominican Republic, and someone who's Haitian, she's not going to glorify the Haitians. She's going to talk about what more they have so much in common, but here we have, due to an arbitrary line and due to the way that two different, the French and the Spanish have influenced these islands. Haiti has a specific special history, which is different. The first black successful rebellion. But apart from that, it's fascinating to look at as a kind of case study as well. I will close with that. So that's the end of lecture 8, I believe. And we will reconvene in a few minutes for the third lecture for today. Thank you.